Cathaoirleach, Councillor Harding, Lord Dunsany, ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of the Francis Ledwidge Museum, I'd like to extend a very warm welcome to you all here this afternoon for a very august occasion here to the public launch of Poems by Francis Ledwidge in partnership with Gallery Press. After an enforced break of 3 years, it is indeed wonderful that we can actually come together to celebrate the poetry of Francis Ledwidge, one of the great literary figures of County Meath. This year actually marks the 40th anniversary of the establishment of the Francis Ledwidge Museum. I want to pay tribute to all of those who have kind of gone before us in terms of who came together all those years ago with the vision and the kind of unity of purpose in setting up to preserve the memory of Francis Ledwidge Museum. I wish to extend a very warm welcome in particular to Vivian Igo, one of the founding members of the original committee and who's with us here today. So Vivian, you're especially welcome here to join us today. Indeed, over the years, so many committee members have played a crucial role and contributed so much to preserving the memory of Francis Ledwidge in our community. And it is only right and proper that we kind of acknowledge people's unwavering and unstinting kind of commitment and dedication. And it serves as a reminder to those of us who are involved today to indeed honour and preserve that kind of legacy. Today marks the launch of Poems by Francis Ledwidge. As you'll understand, a huge amount of work and effort goes into making today a reality. So a special word of thanks to Peter Fallon of Gallery Press, our partners in the publication, and just especially to our colleague from the committee, Rosemary Ure, who's done incredible kind of work in kind of steering and coordinating the project from an initial idea and discussion a couple of years ago to making today a kind of reality. So a special thank you to both of those who are following. In particular, we wish to acknowledge the financial support of Meath County Council through the Meath Library Service for their unwavering kind of guidance and support of this publication. And indeed, without that support, this publication would not have been possible. So we want to extend a very warm appreciation and acknowledgement to Meath County Council for their financial backing. For our launch today, we also wish to acknowledge the generous support of Carmel Nocton and Slane Credit Union, which has allowed us to indeed mark the occasion in the manner befitting the new publication. A special note of thanks also to the staff of the castle here today for their hospitality and facilitating us here today. Finally, I wish to express my deep kind of gratitude to the members of our hard-working kind of committee for their ongoing support and commitment to the committee. And I think today we can be rightly proud as we stand here to mark the 40th anniversary with the launch of this wonderful publication. Martin, Tásúla go bain si goléir tanmh as an clár atá in an dúm.
Céad míle fáilte romh goléir Caisleán Ballasláine an lá brathnach seo. Terry, thank you very much for my introduction, and it's ladies and gentlemen, it's lovely to see you all here today, and I'm delighted to be here as Cathaoirleach of the Ledwidge Bettyside District. And what a fantastic room to host such a prestigious occasion. The Ledwidge Committee has protected the legacy of the World War I poet, and indeed the room has been through its own war, with its famed ceiling coming under threat from a fire that devastated the entire castle just 30 years ago. And it is an extraordinary testament to Henry Charles and his family to restore the castle to its present glory. Well done to all of them and all involved in what was an extraordinary process. Francis Ledwidge was a man in his 20s when he went to take part in the Great War, and months before his own death he penned a poem to his friend Thomas MacDonagh, who was executed for his part in the 1916 Rising. And indeed, the records of the infirmary in Navan record the death of 27-year-old George Keep, the chauffeur of Slane Castle, at the Battle of Ashburn. If you think about that, our community and the impact that would have had 100 years ago in a community. We know the people around here who have worked for the castle all over the years, and it just goes the conflicting things that were happening at the time and the impact it had on its community around us. But with rebellion and civil war and world wars comes treaties, truces and peace, so that communities can heal, remember and respect legacies. The Ledwidge Museum Committee is an example of this, as they celebrate 40 years this year since they opened the Poets' Cottage as a museum. I want to remember Peter Baxter, the then chair, and indeed all the people who contributed to keeping Francis Ledwidge's legacy alive throughout those years. I want to mention Rosemary and indeed John Clark. And I met our president, the present-day president, Jimmy Comiskey outside, and all those who put so much effort into the cottage over the years. It must be a very proud day for you today. Going back to Ledwidge, and I think it's important that we talk about how conflicted he was as a very, very young man. And I heard just this week a radio show talking about a young Irishman who has been signed up to fight in Ukraine. How things and how history repeats itself and how we don't learn from the mistakes we made in the past. Ledwidge went to fight for the rights of small nations, and 100 years later we too are trying to stop the aggression that has happened in Europe for the first time in so many, many years. It's an absolute privilege for me to be here today. I want to wish the committee and Terry and all of you the very best of luck today. It's a fantastic publication, and well done to all of us. Thank you very much.
Let me tell you a little about the evolution of this book. Last year sometime, Rosemary contacted me and it became clear that an edition that they had purchased the stock of had sold out. And she basically was wondering what to do. And I said, well, one possibility is to reprint it. Is that what you want to do? And it became clear that it wasn't really. And we tossed around at a meeting various other possibilities. And it began to emerge that what she was thinking was that possibly we at the Gallery Press would produce a new edition of poems by Francis Ledwidge. And we undertook to do that, to edit, redesign, and try to present something that would represent his work for future generations. There have been, as I've written, 3 books of poems that are called the complete poems of Francis Ledwidge. None of them is complete, in fact. So we called this simply poems. And I went back to a book from just over 100 years ago to work on as a base for this book. The first part of 3 parts in that book was the one book that he saw in his lifetime. The second part was a book that was being printed at the time of his death. And the third part was a group called Last Songs that was gathered and selected by Lord Dunsany, the 18th Lord Dunsany. And to those 3 parts, for each of which that Lord Dunsany wrote an introduction, I added poems that had been gathered by Alice Curtain and another editor, and then with the help of Joe Doyle, who provided poems that were in the castle, unpublished poems. I added more, a small selection, I must say, because between ourselves, the barrel had been fairly well scraped, I'd have to say. And so for the first time, The Poet from Meath is published by a publisher in Meath. And it's my great privilege now to introduce 3 people who are going to speak. First, John Donoghue, from the Meath Chronicle, who has been a champion of all things that we have done, and he's going to officially launch the book. He's going to be followed by Randall Plunkett, the 21st Lord Dunsany, and we are thrilled that besides the good work that we know that he's doing with the estate, that he is taking such an interest in the legacy of his great-grandfather. And then Joe Doyle, who has been such a champion and has been archivist at the castle and a great help to this project. So first of all, please, John Donoghue.
First of all, I'd like to dedicate my talk here today to my late godfather, Michael Smith from Dunsany, whose funeral took place on Christmas Eve last. And Michael was a local historian in the area, but who he also had a family connection to the whole Ledwidge Plunkett story, as both his grandparents worked for the late Edward Plunkett, the 18th Baron, and had memories of Ledwidge, while he himself, following his retirement from Tara Mines, worked with Randall and his late mother Maria Lease, and we remember all of those today. My own earliest realisation of the close connection between Ledwidge and Dunsany was while at the small primary school in Dunsany, where in the corner of the classroom, in an old glass-fronted press typical of those national schools, there was a very precious copy kept of Alice Curtain's biography of the Slane poet, only taken out on very special occasions. And then handwritten by the headmaster, Seamus Conroy, in coloured marker on a large white sheet of glossy paper on the back of the classroom door was the Lament for Thomas MacDonagh, which we all learned by heart, and I'd say is one of the very few poems I can probably still recite fully. Who was this lord of the manor who saw the potential and talent of the young county council road worker and trade unionist from Slane on the other side of the Boyne Valley? He was Edward John Morton Drax Plunkett, son of Admiral Lord Dunsany, Edward Plunkett of Dunsany Castle, and Lady Dunsany of Dunstall Priory near Shoreham in Kent in England. He was born at Park Square near Regent's Park in London, and his father returned to Ireland on succeeding the title. Dunsany wrote the preface for Ledwidge's first volume of poems, Songs of the Field, which Peter Fallon and the gallery reproduce here in this collection, and which Herbert Jenkins of London had agreed to publish. The trade union activist he was now, Ledwidge was also now a member of Navan Urban Council and active in the Slane Corps of the Volunteers. But the war clouds were gathering, and when England declared war on Germany, Dunsany signed up to the Royal Inniskilling Fusiliers in Richmond Barracks, and Jenkins put the publication on hold. Navan Rural District Council proposed to support James Redmond's call for the volunteers to join the war effort, and the poet was laughed at when he disagreed, saying Home Rule was as far away as ever. He was told he was pro-German. The resolution was passed with only Ledwidge dissenting. But in another of the great contradictions of his life, in October 1914, Ledwidge enlisted in the Royal Inniskilling Fusiliers at Richmond's Barracks in Dublin. In the early days of his own career, Dunsany struggled to have his work seen beyond his title and aristocratic background. And when he decided that a writer like the peasant poet deserved to become a star, then that person's background and social standing was of no consequence. As he wrote in the introduction of Songs for the Fields, I hope that not too many will be attracted to this book on account of the author being a peasant, lest he come to be praised by the How Interesting School. For know that neither in any class, nor in any country, nor in any age, shall you predict the footfall of Pegasus, who touches the earth where he pleaseth and is bridled by whom he will. Thank you very much.
Hello, and thank you for having me. My name is Randall Plunkett. I am the grandson of, well, we'll go by numbers because in Dunsany we all have the same name and it's very confusing. So we'll go by 18, Lord Dunsany 18. I'm 21, just by the way. I wish I was 21 in age, but times have passed very quickly for me on that one. It's a good day for poetry. And I look around this room and I'm thinking to myself, there's problems in nature, there's problems in Ukraine, there's problems everywhere, but today it's a good day for culture in Ireland. So I'd very much first like to start the day with thanking the group, Mr. Fallon, Joe Doyle, who got these things sorted, and today we can celebrate something of the last chapter of Dunsany and Ledwidge. Now, that's not morbid, we're not being morbid today, we want to celebrate that perhaps these last few poems that have never seen the light of print can finally be given back to the Irish people, and we can celebrate a great man who didn't have the chance and unfortunately died too young. And I look at the eyes of this man and I think he suffered a great deal in life, but today, if he could see his body of work and see what has become and how celebrated a poor man who got a small opportunity and to grow into something fantastic like it is today, I really think he'd be very proud. And my grandfather would say that it was a responsibility of the Dunsaneys to make sure that these things were given a proper opportunity. And thank you, the group. I'd like to get everyone to clap. First off. Now, I think quite a few people here probably know that we are doing quite a lot with the environment. But a lot of other people probably don't know that part of Dunsaneny's job is to look after history. And I feel that Ledwidge was part of Dunsany history. It's a small part that we were able, very luckily, to protect and look after these last few years. And it's a great privilege and something bittersweet, because I think my parents would have really appreciated today and to see this finally being given back in such a great place, in such a fantastic room, may I add as well. So this works has been hard working over the last few years to put together. Joe Doyle and Mr. Fallon have worked tirelessly to get it together. I'm looking at it and I'm very proud of the final result, and I think everybody here will enjoy it immensely. Now, I could talk for Ireland, and I'm sure many of you have heard me talk for Ireland, so I will keep it brief because it's hot and everybody wants their tea. So, and a few people, including mine, have already fallen asleep. You can see she's tired of my material as it is. But I would like to pretty much say that with all pride, my great-grandfather, who was a machine for producing work, but I think one of the great things he did was be able to give Ledwidge to the world and be able to give a voice to a man who had plenty to say. And I think looking back at his work and looking about his contribution, I think my great-grandfather would feel that the people of this room, the tireless hours that were put in to get this work out, he would be proud and honored that he had something to do with that. And so I thank everybody here for coming, and I'd like to thank everybody who made this happen. And as the representative of Dunsany, I'm very proud today to be part of this and to be invited. So thank you so much, and I'd like to pass on the microphone to Joe Doyle, who has much more fascinating things to say than myself. So enjoy your tea, and thank you so much for having us here.
I'm going to read a couple of small pieces from Ledwidge's correspondence first, and then a small sampling from the poetry, and I think Peter might then close with a couple more pieces. But we will not delay you further now. For those who want to explore a little bit further later, myself and Randall will be around, and Peter for that matter, and we've brought today, very specially, a small selection from the archives at Dunsany of original manuscript poetry, some typescripts, because Ledwidge actually typed up a lot of his work as he went, and also a few of the letters. So we'll have these in the folders over here, at this side, if anybody would like to come and have a little look. We have to be very careful. These works are all over 100 years. We've kept them going this far, but we thought it was a good moment to bring just a little sampling along. And then for anybody who wants to explore further, if there's any academic interest in that, Randall and I are always open to discuss access. So without further ado, let me just follow on John's fantastic talk with a brief extract from some of the last correspondence that reached Dunsany from Ledwidge's time on the front line. One of the really sad things is we'll never know the full body of work that Ledwidge had, because he was writing constantly as he was on campaign. Most of the early work, we believe, is preserved. It was at home or in letters to Dunsany and other writers, for example. But as he was on campaign, he had a lot of work just tucked in a pocket or in his backpack. We know in the last year he had a little notebook that he was writing in. The notebook, for example, was lost in the explosion which killed him, and the manuscripts on several occasions were destroyed by weather and other war conditions. Much of that work he did reproduce and send back, but along the way probably some slipped away. So some of this we'll probably never see. But he himself was very keen. He was so pleased with the first book and so keen to see that second book, and he so very nearly made it. Writing in, it was around the 8th of July, the letter reached here around the 12th, he mentioned that, "I wonder if you have time to write a little piece of an introduction for the book so we can get it to market by October. I won't be back myself at that time, and I leave everything to yourself and Lady Dunsany, but I so much look forward to having that work in my hands." if he'd had just had a couple more months, because of course by October the war would almost have been over. And then the last letter to reach Dunsany, it must have been very poignant later. All these letters were kept with their little active service envelopes from the front in the library in Dunsany. There's a special hidden place where they are stored. And he said there, "I'm busy getting off some more verse for the book, which certainly must come out this year, as I really want to be free when I return to be able to make new terms." So he was already thinking of the next book again, the third book, which he never saw at all. And of course, Ledwidge was a very practical man as well. He was a man who'd had to come from quite hard beginnings and had had some difficult moments along the way. So he also mentioned, and with all respect to good publishers like Peter, "Jenkins is a robber, my current publisher." But in the meantime, he had time for a little humour as well. He finished the letter with a little postscript about a lieutenant in the same company that both himself and Dunsany had been associated with, and he had recently discovered that this gentleman had been a traveller selling advertisements for the Standard newspaper in Derry, where he had also published a piece or two. And he closed with, "And you have entertained this gentleman?" But okay, let's move from the human. I have, if anybody wants to look later, some of the early letters as well, when he was still feeling his way with Dunsany and was very formal. But as you see, by the end, a real friendship had developed, despite the big difference in circumstances. And something that's important to remember, Dunsany had never meant Ledwidge to be anywhere near the war. He offered him a pension, and he almost blacklisted him when he did manage to sign up, because something not everybody's aware of, Ledwidge signed up twice, or tried to. The first time round, he was actually turned down on grounds of ill health. But he was so determined to get in and get out there and help the war that he saw his doctor, dealt with something, and came back. And Dunsany only found out he'd signed up after he showed up in Derry already. And he was not, as you've heard already, best pleased about that, because he really thought the poets should be protected from things like war, should be kept apart from that. He knew how dangerous it was. But now I'm going to read a small sampling of the work. As Peter mentioned, there's a good deal of unpublished work, but it's important to understand that Ledwidge and Dunsany had actually reviewed all of that work, and much of it they had chosen to leave unpublished. Now, Dunsany does mention in the introductions that due to exigencies of war, the books were smaller than they might have been, and perhaps a few more poems might have made it through, but much of what was preserved was something that Ledwidge had worked through, but then had decided wasn't maybe ready for publication. So it's not that there should be any idea that all of it was meant to be out there. It was not. He had himself his own ideas, and over time his style had changed. He'd experimented in a number of areas. And while he's famous for the nature poetry, there had been other phases too. An important aspect was always, though, his love of Ireland. So I'm going to read two short poems which touched on that theme of Ireland in general. And I think come partly from his interesting perspective in having been part of the nationalist movement. Even when it split, he had to take sides within that, but also coming at it from a perspective of somebody writing from a war fought within the imperial context still. So, a poem called simply Ireland, one of two poems with that simple title, written in December 1916 and sent from, I think, ship between two parts of the battlefield. How blue the wild violet, how dark the wild sloe, how red is the rose and how white is the snow. And the orchards of orange on the plains of Lebanon, how red, how red is the corn by the Shannon. All these you have seen, you were wandering so long, even such is my love, and they do her great wrong. Nowhere on the earth are such souths in the spring, should the birds of far countries come up there to sing, and nowhere such goldener wests ever glare, and nowhere such lights fill the north as up there. But they've taken her crown, and they broke it in three, and buried it deep in the green of the sea. And then, in a slightly different spirit, in 1915, as far as we know, although this work is a little bit less clear as to dating, he wrote one about the lament of Banda, one of the mystical concepts for Ireland. It's my grief that the childer who love me will be quarrelling about me all day, when I could be at peace in my cabin, far out of the dark sorrow's way. One says he will build me on Tara, a high palace fit for a queen, and another one says that large houses have the tables that's empty and mean. And I sigh for the true ones that left me, for the new loves over the main, for the soldiers that fell at Landen, and the harps that are under Louvain, two places he'd seen on campaign. But I could be at pace in my cabin, built here at the sunset tide, if only the children who love me would stand as one by my side. I think that's one of the most interesting pieces in terms of tone. There was a bit of a discussion between himself and Dunsany because Dunsany was not fond of the attempt to put Irish language into a kind of anglicised script. This was also a debate that Ledwidge had been part of with people like Lady Gregory, trying to represent the Kiltartan dialect. And those two contrast very much. The first one is quite formal and very standard. The second one is trying to get across some expression in, shall we say, a more familiar form. But I think it's something that was lost later. Because I think what also happened with Ledwidge later is there were many agendas around his work. Many people took up different aspects. But I'm going to go next with, I think, the one best known in the wider country, part of the national curriculum for many years, and I think rightly so. It was truly one of his outstanding works. So, it's often put as the lament for Thomas MacDonagh. In fact, in the manuscript, it is simply Thomas MacDonagh. He knew MacDonagh personally. They were friends. He'd been part of the circles he mixed in Dublin. And it was something he felt very personally, and he followed this, as some of you may know, it's in the book, so you can also read it later, with a poem specifically to MacDonagh's wife. But anyway, I think this will be familiar to most. He shall not hear the bittern cry in the wild sky where he is lain, nor voices of the sweeter birds above the wailing rain. Nor shall he know when loud March blows through slanting snows her fanfare shrill, blowing to flame the golden cup of many an upset daffodil. But when the dark cow leaves the moor and pastures poor with greedy weeds, perhaps he'll hear her low at morn, lifting her horn in pleasant meads. It was a beautiful work for that. And I'm going to close with two more poems of place, because I think in all my years of reading Ledwidge, including the less known works, place is the thing that maybe is most central. There's the romance, there's the themes of Ireland, there's the themes of creatures of nature, but it is place that resounds most strongly. So one of my favourites among the works is a little poem called Serbia, or sometimes the Lake of Doiran, a place in what is now on the borders of Serbia and Montenegro. Beside the Lake of Doiran, I watched the night fade star by star, and sudden glories of the dawn shine on the muddy ranks of war. All night my dreams of that fair band were full of Ireland's old regret, and when the morning filled the sky, I wondered, could we save her yet? Far up the cloudy hills the roads wound wearily into the morn. I only saw with inner eye a poor old woman all forlorn. And then the very last for my selection, the other Ireland poem. And you'll see each of the three about this theme of Ireland are quite different. But this is in one of his classical styles, as I think of it. Simply Ireland. I called you by sweet names, by wood and linn. You answered not because my voice was new, and you were listening for the hounds of Finn and the long hosts of Lugh. And so I came unto a windy height, and cried my sorrow, but you heard no wind, for you were listening to small ships in flight, and the wail on hills behind. And then I left you, wandering the war, armed with will from distant goal to goal, to find you at last free as of yore, or die to save your soul. And then you called to us from far and near, to bring your crown from out of the deeps of time, this theme again. It is my grief, your voice I couldn't hear in such a distant clime. And if he had just made it another year or two, he would have seen that dream, because this was his dream of Ireland back there, a crown among the other nations. Thank you.
Allow me, please, to finish with two poems. Ledwidge, as we know, wrote exquisite lyrics and will be forever known and revered for them. It's not just because we knew Randall was coming today that there was attention to the association with the 18th Lord Dunsany. That is a key and critical part of Ledwidge's being. but it's just right to acknowledge it at any time. And as Joe spoke about, as John spoke about, the association subsequently with Mary Lavin. And John told me privately that by a further extension, when he was starting out as a cub journalist, Mary's daughter, Caroline Walsh, was a great help to him. So succession carries on, as John Montague would say. This is a tiny poem called The Herons, and I've always been attracted to it, not least because it involves a trip that Ledwidge apparently used to make regularly from Slane to Mount Nugent to visit an old school teacher of his. And the poem mentions Loch Sheelin. And for 100 years, in those 3 books that I mentioned earlier, Sheelin had been spelt wrong. And in fact, for 100 years and more, in those 3 books that I mentioned earlier, that great poem that Joe just read, the Lament for Thomas MacDonagh, Thomas MacDonagh's name was spelt wrong. So not only was he executed by the English, his name was spelt wrong for more than a century. The Herons. As I was climbing Ardon Moor from the shore of Sheelin Lake, I met the herons coming down before the waters wake. And they were talking in their flight of dreamy ways the herons go, when all the hills are withered up, nor any waters flow. And this is a poem called To One Dead, a pure, mysterious lyric poem, a song. A blackbird singing on a moss-upholstered stone, bluebells swinging, shadows wildly blown, a song in the wood, a ship on the sea. The song was for you, and the ship was for me. A blackbird singing I hear in my troubled mind, bluebells swinging I see in a distant wind. But sorrow and silence are the wood's threnody, the silence for you and the sorrow for me. Thank you very much.